Right before we jump into this video, if you'd like me to send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations, just look for this orange box over on the website, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I will send you that guide for free. Steven, I can see the comments now. Canon's in trouble. Jared, Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is the preview of the just announced Sony A1. It is Sony's flagship camera, the top of the line. Now, I do want to say we do not have a hands-on just yet, but we hope to be getting a body soon so that we can go in more depth and share some files and information with you when we do get it. But right now, we got a lot of specs. So let's go over the specs, starting with an all-new 50 megapixel stacked BSI sensor. That is a stacked 50 megapixel sensor. That is insane. It gives you 15 stops of dynamic range. Now, it has the same form factor, the body, as the A9 II. It's also going to be very similar to that of the A7R4 and what I could only assume is the A7 IV in the future. The only difference is on the top left-hand side, it has a dial for changing the speeds of how many frames a second and a few other things that you might be doing. There are dual Bions XR processors. You can do ISO 100 to 32,000, which is interesting because the A9 II was able to do up to 51,200 before going into the expanded modes. So does that 50 megapixels mean that you're going to get less quality at higher ISO? Or is the fact that this is 4 years newer than the technology in the A9 II, because that was an older sensor, 4 years now, is it going to give you better high ISO capability? That's one of my biggest questions, is how well will it do with 50 megapixels at higher ISOs? I think it needs to be better than what the A9 II offers you. At least that's what I would hope, that it's at least a little bit better and a little bit cleaner, but we will see when we get our hands on it. Now, the biggest spec of all beyond the 50 megapixels is 30 frames per second. Yes, that's 30 frames per second stills with the electronic shutter. Now, when you shoot in 30 frames per second, you are dumbing the RAW file down to 12-bit RAW. Now, if you want to get 14-bit RAW, you can do lossless compressed 14-bit as well as uncompressed 14-bit, but you will get 20 frames per second with those. I think that for the most part, I will be shooting at 20 frames per second. I guess unless I'm shooting sports or baseball where you want to get the ball on the bat. Could you imagine how many times you're going to get the ball coming in, you're going to get the ball on the bat, you're going to get the ball going out. That's something I could never do with 8 frames a second or 10 frames a second back in the day, unless you got pretty lucky with your timing when you were shooting. But 30 frames per second at 50 megapixels is going to be insane. Now, the max shutter speed that you can get with the electronic shutter is 1/32,000th of a second. Now, that means if you're shooting wide open at, say, 1.2 outside at 100 ISO, you can speed up that shutter up to 1/32,000th of a second and still get that shallow depth of field. Now, how many frames per second can you get with a mechanical shutter? The answer is 10 frames per second, which I questioned. And I'll have answers for why it doesn't do more than that, but 10 seems kind of low, especially when the EOS R5 is doing 12 frames per second with mechanical and 20 in silent mode, and the same thing with the R6. It's doing 12 frames and 20 frames, but you're getting 10 frames per second with a brand new mechanical shutter, and it has what they say, carbon fiber shutter blade, so you should get up to 500,000 actuations, though this camera is really meant to be shooting in the electronic mode, so you'll probably never outrun the life cycle of the mechanical shutter. Now, speaking of outrunning, how many frames per second can you get when you're shooting 30 frames per second compressed RAW files? You can get 155 in a row. That's roughly 5 seconds. And when you're doing uncompressed, you can do 82 uncompressed, which is about 2.7 seconds of shooting. You really shouldn't be able to outrun this camera, especially now that it has 2 different kinds of cards that it can take. It can take dual SDXC, or it can take CF Express Type A. Now, Type B are these bad boys right here that we find in the Canon and Nikon cameras, but Type A is smaller. It's not as fast as B, but it is still pretty nice and snappy and fast, and is smaller than an SD card, and so Sony went with those. You should really never be able to outrun the buffer inside of this camera, or you shouldn't really outrun the write speed of these cards, because the CF Express Type A's are nice and quick. Moving on, one of the issues with using an electronic shutter is that you may end up with some distortion. For example, if you have a ball that's flying, you may see it look a little distorted. Or a bigger example is when somebody swings a golf club, is the golf club distorting because the read speed isn't fast enough? Now, I have seen that a few times with the Canons. I also saw it with the A9 II at some points, but Sony is saying that they have a new anti-distortion electronic shutter in here that is 1.5 times better than the A9 II. The example they showed was a guy swinging a golf club, and it looked fantastic. Will it be good in the real world? We'll have to see, but something tells me with the fast readout speed now that it can do 50 megapixels, 30 frames per second. It's much faster than what the A9 II was doing, which means you should see less distortion. Now, another thing that's an issue with electronic shutters is flicker. When you get the LED light strobing or just you pick up that flicker, they now have a new anti-flicker mode, which means when you're shooting with the flick, it only takes a picture on the or basically what it is, you go into this mode, it will be timed to specific pulses of LED lights that may be in the background on the basketball court that were getting some banding in the past. You may not see that now because it will shoot photos when that flick is not actually happening. Now, I ran into this issue when I was photographing Senator Bernie Sanders. You can see in the photo that I got lucky that the flicker was, it basically framed his face. But yeah, that was a kind of a mistake, but I got lucky that it was in the right area. But this anti-flicker mode is new, and there's another variable mode that's interesting. It was in the A9 II as well, but you can dial in up to 1/8064.5 of a second, or other places like 1/200.54 of a second, just in case you are seeing some flicker from the LEDs that you're shooting under, especially at concerts. If you can dial in variable different shutter speeds and meet the different flickering of that, and now you don't see it, that's gonna be a big deal. Now, speaking of big deals, this is a big deal. You can do flash sync at up to 1/400th of a second. That's faster than most other cameras that let you do it at 1/250th of a second. There hasn't been a camera in a long time since like a 1D from Canon that lets you do 1/400th of a second with a flash sync. But even a bigger deal is the fact that you can now use the electronic shutter and shoot at 1/200th of a second flash sync. That's right, with an electronic shutter, you can now pop a strobe off and capture it. Before, you couldn't do that. That's a testament to how fast the readout is on this sensor. That is super fast that they can now do that. That's a big deal for those portrait photographers or people that want to go ahead and shoot with the electronic shutter, which begs the question, is a mechanical shutter even needed anymore? Because I think that when Canon comes out with their R1X or whatever they call it, they may put in their 20 frames per second mechanical shutter because that's what they have. But is a mechanical shutter needed if Sony was able to get the electronic shutter so well that you don't get flickering and you don't get distortion? That would be an absolute big deal. Speaking of big deal, could you do me a big favor and hit that thumbs up button for this preview? Because when you do that, it lets YouTube know that you like my video and maybe it will show it to more people. So that would be a big deal to me. Flipping over the paper, let's talk about autofocusing points. 759 autofocusing points. That gives you 92% coverage. Keep in mind that the R5 and the R6 has 100% coverage of their sensor with autofocusing points. There's going to be a lot of comparisons to the R5 with this camera, the A1. I'll talk more about that at the end of this video, but there's going to be a ton of people trying to say that this crushed Canon. And no, I really don't think that it crushed Canon. Now, in terms of autofocus, they say that it reads the autofocus 2 times faster than the A9 II. So you have twice as fast autofocus readout, which is a big deal because this is a super fast focusing camera. Now with faster real-time tracking, as well as IAF is going to be faster and it's going to track those animals. So if you're a nature photographer or you photograph birds and you can now track even better, you can track the eye of the eagle, the eye of the tiger, running up into the... Yeah, if you could track the eye of the tiger even better, especially if it's running at you and you're in Africa and it's attacking, you better get out of the way fast. But at least you'll get the picture. So that's a big deal. Let me jump in here real quick to show you this photo that was taken with a Sony A7 III almost 3 years ago. I'm gonna edit it using FroPack 2, starting with AC/DC with one click, looks fantastic. Then we've got Bob Ross, followed by Charlie Brown. Next, there's a bunch of Cinnamon Toast Crunches that look pretty cool. We actually include this as one preset, but it's 3 different ones, followed by double stuffed Oreos with no vignette. Gives you a nice crunchy black and white. Then we've got matte black, which we also give you a bunch of different options for. Now, if you're looking for a great starting point or to speed up your RAW workflow, no matter what camera system you use or what RAW files you have, we created 15 all-new custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPack2. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters, and if you decide to pick them up right now, they're currently on sale, or you can save even more when you bundle FroPack 1 and FroPack 2 together. Now, let's get back to the A1 preview. Now let's talk about the EVF. There's a 9.44 million dot EVF that does a 240 frames per second refresh rate. I believe that's the first time we're seeing that in a camera. That is a super fast refresh rate, which is supposed to give you a clearer, crisper image. And when you are photographing sports, it doesn't let you miss anything. And speaking of not missing anything, there is no blackout, just like the A9 II and the A9. You have no blackout when you are shooting those 30 frames per second. There's 5-axis IBIS with up to 5.5 stops of stabilization. This is something where Canon kind of knocks it out of the park and beats Sony. This is something that Sony hasn't done a lot of work on, at least it seems like, because Canon is able to get 6, 7, 8 stops in combination with their lenses and their IBIS built in. Now, in terms of the LCD screen, do you have a flip-out rotatable screen? No. Does Jared care about that? No, he doesn't. But what I do care about is it still has a crappy 1.44 million pixel LCD screen. That's not a great screen. You will have the updated menu system, which is a nice plus to have, but I do want to say that anybody that was complaining about Sony's terrible menu system, look, the more you use any menu system, the more you learn it. And the more I used it, the easier it became. Was it perfect? No. But it wasn't that big of a deal that you should really be focusing on that as being a reason not to buy a camera. Now, let's move on to the video specs. You can shoot full frame 8K up to 30 frames per second in 10-bit 420. Now, it's oversampled 8.6K with no pixel binning and full autofocus. You can record 8K to the SD card, and the reason for that is there's no all-I or RAW recording internally. It's a much smaller, more compressed file than what you find in the Canon EOS R5, which is what we're using right now. We shoot in the oversampled 4K, in 4K HQ, which is 8K sampled down to the 4K, which gives us a super nice, sharp image, and that's why we switched over to using the Canon EOS R5 here in the studio. Now, for me personally, shooting stills, I'm still using the Sony A7R4, but at this point, this A1 is probably replacing that for me for my stills camera. Now, with that being said, is if all I had was an EOS R5 and R6 to go shoot, could I do it? Absolutely, because they are fantastic stills cameras as well. All right, moving on, you can do redundant recording of 8K. to both SD cards, because that's what redundant means. So card 1, card 2, you could record 8K to both of them. Now, there is no record limit still. It's not 29.59. That is gone. They did mention there is a 30-minute overheating limit. They also did say that they've gone past that in their testing when shooting 4K 60 and 8K 30. I don't think it's really going to overheat terribly too bad. You're not doing the same all-I files or the downsampled 8K giving you this 4K HQ that we're doing. And by the way, we haven't run into a lot of overheating with the R5. We can shoot for about an hour continuously without running into it, giving us the warning. So it's been good for that. I don't think you're going to run into too many issues with the Sony because of the fact it's using more of a compressed file. You could shoot 4K up to 120 frames per second with a 1.1x crop factor, and there is no 8K downsampled to 4K like the R5, like I mentioned. The price, $6,500, and it's available February 25th or sometime around there. Is $6,500 overpriced? No, this is the flagship of the flagship. Canon's 1DX Mark III is like $6,800. Nikon's D6 is like 60-some hundred bucks. This is priced in the right spot. Does it replace an A9 II? I think it does, but it's a couple grand more expensive. Does it render the EOS R5 from Canon terrible or useless? And the answer is no, because the R5 is a $3,899 camera, and this is a $6,500 camera. They have very similar specs. Yes, Sony wins with that stack sensor and that fast readout, and their autofocus is incredible, but the R5 is an incredible camera with a lot of fantastic technology and the RF lenses to go with it. So if anybody out there is leaving comments saying that this just crushed Canon, it really didn't. Canon still has their 1R or R1 or whatever they're going to be coming out with, their flagship mirrorless camera, and that also reminds me that Nikon is really just left in the dust because they don't even have anything that competes with Canon or anything that competes with Sony at this point. So that was a lot of information about the A1. We're gonna get our hands on it. I think this is gonna be my new daily driver when it comes to still shooting. We're still using the R5s and the R6s here in the studio for shooting video. What do you guys think? Will you pick one of these up? Is it just for newspaper photographers? Let me know what you think. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And thank you very much for watching. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.